HR and Compliance Seminar. And hello to those that are joining us on Zoom. We would love it if your cameras were on, so it felt like you were in the room. As you can see probably on the screen, that a couple of you are just connecting now. So we'll give it a couple of moments for you to all get sorted. But yes, if you could pop your cameras on, lovely, thank you. And hopefully as we go through the session, you can see the panelists, and we'll also take some shots of people in the audience as well. So good morning, everyone. Make sure you're on mute. So morning, Nikki, I think you're, there we go, thank you. Okay, brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I just want to say a special thank you to Charlie and her team at Metrobank for hosting us. And obviously we couldn't do it without you, because we are a not-for-profit organisation and we rely on the facilities of our members to put us up. So thank you very much, Charlie. Today we are covering the regulatory requirements. Has the tide peaked, or is there still more to come? I'm Zoe Foster. I'm chair of the Financial Services Network, and I'm also head of marketing and events at our sponsor, Varan Performance. I'm delighted to see so many of our members in the room with us today, so welcome everyone, and also with us online as well. So if you have just joined us, please switch your cameras on so that we can see who is joining us online as well, so thank you. Health and safety, we're not expecting any fire alarms, so if you do hear something, please run in that direction and follow the exit signs. Please don't use the lift. And the facilities can be found just outside on the right-hand side. The reception will be able to help you. By way of background about the network, we have lots of new members in the room with us today. And really, I just wanted you to know that it's a place for you to come and collaborate, share best practice, all under Chatham House rules. Obviously, we've had to adapt that slightly because we are recording, but if you do have a sensitive question, we've got lots of professionals in the room, so please feel free to take it offline and do some networking afterwards. We are truly passionate about our role in financial services, and we do want to promote a consistent approach to regulation. So please ask questions, speak to your colleagues about what's going on at the moment as we go through today. So just raise your hand, and also online, if you're joining us, you can use the Q&A facilities which we're monitoring, so we can filter those questions in with the panel. Our sponsors are Varan Performance, the leading HR and finance transformation consultancy for financial services and other areas as well. And as well, Osborne Clark, where James is joining us today, and also Olivia in the audience. Osborne Clark are lawyers who strive to help tackle the challenges you're facing today and prepare you for the ones that you will face tomorrow. Probably, I say this every time, my favourite strapline. If you have any questions about the network and of course the sponsors, please speak to me afterwards. Moving on to the agenda. So usually we start with a regulatory update, which lasts about 10 minutes, and James would normally give us a quick update as to what we all need to be aware of. This time, James has said that he's going to incorporate that into the panel session today. So please make a note of anything that James is bringing up with us this morning. I will shortly hand over to Tom Holmes, who's the founding director at Varan Performance. Morning, Tom.
Morning.
And Tom is joined by Associate Director James Turner. He's the Associate Director at the Financial Institute for the Financial Institutions Group. That's quite a mouthful. At Osborne Clark. Welcome, James. And of course, Charlie Mansell, who's the Head of People Operations here at Metrobank. The panel will be discussing the shift in expectations of the SCA and PRA, and highlighting the key trends that we've identified that have impacted us in our role as HR and compliance professionals, both during the time of the network and also pre-network was established. We really want to have a fluid conversation, so as I say, please raise your hand and heckle the panel. And those joining us online, If I can ask those who have just joined us to put their cameras on, that would be wonderful, so that we can get a feel for those who are in the room with us. And please use the Q&A and the chat function, because we will be monitoring that. So the session should take us to about 10 o'clock. So with time in mind, Tom, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thank you. Today is the regulatory lawyer's chance to shine. So I'm joined by James, as Zoe has told us already, and Charlie, who is head of people operations here at Metro Bank, to discuss the last 5 years and the next trends to expect. So we're going to split this between what's happened over the last 5 years, what the situation is now, and what are the predictions for the next 5 years. And all is 5-year business. It's because FSHRC is now 5 years old, during which period we have had 23 different sessions, 2,436 attendees in person. So you guys, you don't count on this occasion because you're all online, and over 260 individual pieces of actionable advice have been given, and some of them, I hope, James, you actioned upon. 8 sessions on SMCR, which broke down to SMCR Part 1, SMCR Part 2, SMC, you get the picture. 8 sessions on that, D&I 4 times, and 22 regulatory updates, which means that in one of our sessions, we got away without a full regulatory update. So that must have been a quiet month. I can't quite remember, James and Charlie. Now, I'll accept any questions during the session. Just post them or shout them out, or just put your hand up, and then Zoe will point it out to me that that's happening. And what I wanted to do was start with a little bit of commentary, which is the big push over the last 5 years has been the trend to move from tick box regulations to allowing us to make our own interpretation and define how we respond. So 5 years ago, and I hope you're going to agree with me, James, when I put this to you, it was much more that the regulatory bodies would tell us exactly what to do, and then we had to action those activities. And the big change 5 years ago, which is why we set up this group, was that there was a greater responsibility for us as individuals within financial institutions and leaders within those, Charlie, to actually interpret them ourselves and work out what the answer was. And that was why we set up this group, so that the communication between all of you guys who are needing to make that interpretation could be more easily made. So I think we're going to break this down into what's happened over the past 5 years, what's going on now, and what those future trends are. And so James and Charlie, I think that we need to kick that off with, we discussed kind of 4 main trends which we could focus on during our pre-preparation. The first is to move from a less tick box approach to a more outcome focused regulatory approach, and we'll talk about that in some depth. The second is the addition of people regulation to technical regulation. 5 or 6 years ago, it was much more about what you did, and then who you are, and we all know the implications of that with FMCR, all those other elements, fit and proper, D&I, or as a regulatory field, etc., etc. Then repetitive regulation. The question of, are we covering old ground again and again? So does regulation build upon itself? And we've seen less of that, and we've seen more of one regulation covering all the ground of the last regulation and then adding a little bit, making things quite complicated, which is James will tell us about more. And then finally, I think we've got to address the question about whether the FCA has become and is going to become a more assertive regulator. So question 1, or my first question for the panel, is really, given the volume of regulatory compliance in recent years, have you seen a shift away from compliance being the responsibility of compliance and legal functions, and more to it being owned by senior leaders, etc.? Has that push really worked? And I'd like to start with you, James.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I mean, whether it's exactly 5 years, I think is possibly open to debate. But certainly I recall the the days effectively in which and it probably was around, it probably started actually a little bit longer than 5 years ago. It's probably around particularly the evolution of the FSA into the FCA, which was overtly more of described itself as a consumer champion. And I think then the trends that really kicked off, I think, we've actually seen probably two, actually. One is definitely what you talked about in terms of the amount of time that senior leaders, particularly in big organisations, now spend in their own right on regulation has undoubtedly gone up significantly. And then I think what has sort of the second trend that has kind of accelerated that subsequently is, or the sort of that has then crystallised, I think, with the senior managers and the certification regime in particular, in which it's now much more overt that you're not there as a senior leader to simply look to your head of legal or your head of compliance for what should we do. It's sitting within literally your job description.
Yes, interesting. And Metrobank, which of course is in the same period, has become the first new regulated bank in the UK for 100 years. Have you seen the same thing, Charlie? Have you seen that move from?
Yes. So I mean, I've now been here for 7.25 years. So I've been here through that whole five-year period. Definitely seen that shift away, and I don't think it's been a kind of a single shift. It's been an evolution over the last few years, which is definitely in the right direction, moving much towards each individual kind of senior leadership, and those individuals taking ownership for their individual areas, but overall ownership as well, and understanding it doesn't sit with compliance, it doesn't sit with legal, and it doesn't sit with HR, like who owns what bits. I think that we've seen kind of a greater understanding of who has kind of overall ownership and responsibility, and actually then who has responsibility for kind of individual parts of things like the SMCR regime in HR operations, whether it's when you actually break down what needs to happen in terms of like reporting and regulation. The process maps are pages and pages and pages long. So, and really understanding who has that ownership and responsibility. I think we have seen that.
Do you think it's worked? Do you think that understanding of the requirements and the regulatory requirements has seeped into the business broadly in a way it wasn't back in when you started?
Yeah, I think there's much greater kind of in-depth understanding now across a broader range of people. Obviously, it has expanded over the years as well in terms of who falls into the scope. But yes, I would say that the level of understanding generally around the business is much higher than it would have been a number of years ago. That's
very interesting, because that actually was one of the underlying objectives. You mentioned being a consumer champion, but also that move from FSA to FCA was about generating that culture across the business. So do you think that's right, James? Do you think that's?
I mean, I think there's probably two things I'd say in response to that. I do agree with Charlie. I do think it has made a difference. And being slightly cynical about it, I think even perhaps at the beginning, it was perhaps more of a stick than a carrot in that sense. That
yes.
actually it undoubtedly focuses minds when the FCA started throwing words around like individual accountability and also particularly post-financial crisis, which I know feels like a very long time ago now in lots of ways. We still have policymakers and politicians being a bit like, well, no one was personally charged with anything, etc. type language. So while I don't think certainly the FCA ever wanted it to become some kind of witch hunt effectively for individuals, it undoubtedly focuses minds that actually you're a senior person, your statement of responsibilities has to be very, very clear. And we talked about the process for creating those before. And that actually the whole point with this was to prevent people being able to say, well, it wasn't really the buck didn't really stop with me. It is meant to be very clear where the buck stops.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. In my experience, it used to be that the regulatory side of things sat over there in a box, and then I was doing the business, as it were. And I think that, you know, putting aside the desire to make people accountable and prosecutions, etc., the real push was about driving a culture in which everybody felt that they had some responsibility for compliance. And it sounds like both of you guys are saying that's changed a lot.
Yes, I mean, the other thing I add, just pivoting for ever so slightly to look forward for a second, the buried in the FCA's most recent consumer duty paper, there are various references to how that will then impact the way that senior managers in particular and certified staff's responsibilities will change, because effectively the so-called consumer duty, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, actually compliance with that will also be built into those people's job descriptions essentially.
So on the other side, this volume of regulation, is that something which is your perception, Charlie, that that's been a tough thing to do in a smaller institution, and that bigger organizations have a great easier chance to do what's necessary?
So, yeah, personal experience here, yes. I think with, you know, that it's effectively for an organisation the same regulations, the same level of understanding, the same breadth of understanding of those, and being able to operationalise any of that. The requirements are the same whether you have an entire team dedicated to it, or you have, you know, it's an individual, or it sits within a team who are, you know, whose day job is something else. And over the last few years, we've seen a real shift to that. I mean, I think in a smaller organisation, that, you know, the technology and the infrastructure isn't necessarily going to be the same, you know, in terms of having a specialist, you know, SMCR compliance system. I know those are out there. You know, there'll be organisations that have that, which really enable them and support them to be able to kind of follow through what they need to do, versus much smaller organisations that don't have dedicated systems or dedicated teams. I think that has proved challenging. And again, for here and in my role, the level of compliance that was involved in my role when I first started compared to now, it's completely different.
Yeah, and so in essence, because of that push that each organisation had to interpret each piece of legislation themselves, that's clearly more easily done on a larger organisation than a smaller one. Has there been any recognition of that, James, from regulatory bodies?
Well, they would say yes. And so in the particularly in both the consumer duty consultations and also the current D&I consultations, which is a joint initiative between the FCA, the Bank of England and the PRA, there is a lot of references to proportionality, and accepting that it's not going to be the same in a sort of household name bank versus a startup, etc. And of course, it covers an incredible variety and range of firms in between. The reason I sort of hesitate and say they would say that is, when push really comes to shove in implementation, you don't often hear the FCA really acknowledge the scale of that challenge, and in particular the way in which you know, there are organisations that I know very well that have armies of compliance people and huge resources that they can call upon. In my sort of outside work, I suppose, I actually sit on the board of a credit union in Brighton, and strictly speaking, credit unions, despite not being not-for-profit, they are still regulated, and so things like the consumer duty will actually apply to them. Just to bring that into a little bit of context, they have the equivalent of 6 FTE.
Right.
So when I gave a presentation about the consumer duty at our January board meeting, it wasn't exactly taken as great news by the chairman and the CEO. And as I say, I think what it comes back to is regulators will say, we acknowledge that, we get that, we want to be proportional, but then never really say, well, that means that you don't need to worry about that, or you can do this in a much lighter way. And so you kind of end up with a sort of regulatory expectations defaulting to the big institutions who can throw dozens and dozens of people at these types of projects, and or end up sort of being the FCA in particular default assumption.
And do you think COVID's made a difference in this area? Because you know, the last couple of years, obviously, that's been enforced, but a really significant change to the way business is done. Has it made it harder or easier, or has it had little effect on either? Firstly, what it feels like to actually need to do this stuff, and then secondly, James, from a point of regulatory compliance itself, as the compliance, the amount of legislation coming out, etc. What are your thoughts, Charlie?
I think actually it might tie back to, again, in similar way, the size of the organisation and where they were before COVID. So what was the culture like in an organisation? Was it quite flexible, able to be adaptable, kind of supportive of change? Were they set up in a great, you know, do they have the technology to support them that we can just instantly move things and be completely remote and still work through that? Or if it was very paper-based and in an office, then having to make that shift to move all that compliance online would have been a bigger step for some organisations versus some who actually were already online, everything was done with the support of technology. I think that would have made it easier for them. Even things like having, you know, an e-signature technology versus having wet signatures and actually going, well, there's only however many of us in an office, we'll just give everything out, get everyone to sign it, and we'll scan it in, or we'll file it away versus everything done. You know, it depends on where the organisation was to begin with, I think. I mean, at Metro Bank, we fairly luckily, I suppose, and, you know, with foresight maybe, you know, we in the HR world anyway, we were very much paperless.
Yeah. So
that I think helped make the shift easier in terms of this is the way we're doing it. Our learning and e-learning is fully remote, so that possibly made it easier. But I think with all the implications of COVID, and it's very difficult to say.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I'd add to what Charlie just said, and then I'll just turn to the regulatory implications, is because I was actually still in-house at a fintech startup when lockdown started, and the way we used to talk about it was basically like a nationwide business continuity exercise, in fact, in the most extreme way. And organisations that I think you're right in the sense that I do think probably the biggest predictor was actually your cultural starting point. I think actually if you had a very open, collaborative culture to start with, that probably was easier. I can only imagine that in extremely hierarchical organisations, actually the change to suddenly no one being in the same room or the same building must have been actually very, very difficult to maintain productivity. And of course also, yeah, that's my point actually. I think number one priority in March 2020, when everyone was sent home, is for lots of organisations was, are we still going to be here in however long it's time? So I think to that extent, so I certainly think when I think about lots of my clients is that lots of them, that if you described lockdown to them in 2019 would have been utterly horrified and thought there's no way we will manage that. And most organisations, or many organisations in one form or another, coped. Some thrived, many coped. And I think from the regulatory perspective, certainly the FCA's response in particular, there were some very, very specific responses. So for example, in mortgage lending and consumer finance, there were some very specific, very urgent interventions around giving payment holidays, essentially. But also, I think there was some broader concern about what would happen to the culture of those organisations when no one's there to sort of physically keep an eye on everyone else, which I know sounds very cynical, but I think that was the FCA's worry, actually. When people aren't in the same building, actually, what kind of behaviours will then simply go unseen? I think certainly from an enforcement perspective, nothing, touch wood, nothing sort of overtly catastrophic appears to have occurred purely as a result of COVID in a way that has caused the FCA to need to take any enforcement action. But I do think one of the FCA's big themes actually is operational resilience. And I think if as a senior business leader, you were in a financial institution, you were not constantly thinking about your operational resilience, you probably are now.
Has it changed the pace of regulations? Does it lead to, there being consulting papers, etc., put off and delayed whilst more operational matters were being resolved?
I think formally, no. Informally, we now have, in the case particularly of the payment holiday work for mortgages and unsecured lending, we effectively do now have effectively a precedent in which the entire industry in major sectors can effectively implement massive technical and product changes to their products with days notice. Now, admittedly, certainly thinking back to my own organisation and having spoken to lots of the clients in the time that I've been at Osborne Clarke, I don't think people regard that as a good precedent, and certainly don't want that to become the norm in terms of the way in which regulatory changes is implemented. But the problem is, in some ways, it's a bit like lockdown. Now that it's happened, it's now a real thing in a policymaker's mind. But actually, those changes to mortgages, that's something that IT people in previous roles would have told me, oh, that'll take months, and it was basically done in about 5 days.
I wonder if it's had effect on the associated kind of Brexit angle, which also happened in recent years, which was a drive in part to allow differential regulation, etc. I wonder if those have been delayed by the double pressure of the pressure of COVID, which has kind of rather taken over from a closer look at what difference being outside the European Union might make.
I mean, I just take that for a second. There's no doubt that from a governmental bandwidth point of view, there was a long period in 2020 when there was just no room to think about anything other than COVID. So quite what that will do in the long term, I think, is much more questionable, because one of the things about Brexit, from my perspective, is the Brexit, from a regulatory perspective, I think has to very much be seen as a very long process, and effectively ceasing to be a member of the European Union was kind of only stage one of that process. And so now you get people like Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, I'm in charge of finding a Brexit dividend, etc. So much of our financial services regulation is European derived that it is a very significant job working out what you want to keep, tweak, get rid of. And that's not something that can be done in a short period of time.
And that person themselves were only appointed a few months ago. So I suppose that defines that there is a significant delay, presumably a lot of post-COVID work to be done in advance of that, Charlie. One of the other pushes was, or one of the concerns was that material risk takers, senior managers, etc., would challenge the boundaries of the work which they wanted to do. I remember there was a lot of conversation about changing their terms and conditions, adding it to their activities, etc., and an expectation that they would be very resistant. Is that something you've seen, Charlie, or has your broader group of senior managers actually taken it on very well?
Broadly, yes, I think taken on well. I don't think there has been resistance, but there has been some, I guess, challenge. And I guess the nuance there for me is it's not a tick box exercise in this is your role and you have these responsibilities, just sign here to make sure you understand it, and it just being brushed away. Actually, we see senior leaders really kind of challenging, going, I want to really make sure these are my responsibilities and this is what is within the remit of my role, and that there is a back and forth dialogue around that. So it's definitely something that is taken very seriously. So I think there's challenge in that respect. There isn't a one person saying, right, you guys, here's your responsibility, sign up here and that's done. It's an ongoing dialogue and discussion, and making sure that actually, I think all the senior leaders really really fundamentally understand what this means for them. I definitely think it's that there, and that there is a high level of acceptance.
There is a high level of acceptance. That's my impression too. That actually, although we were concerned right at the beginning that this would really, some people would leave the industry, other people would be very resistant to taking on what actually is a significant set of additional roles. But I haven't really seen that.
I think that personally, that might be partly down to the where, like you say, we've had stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. I mean, I think if a few, we were talking about 5, 6, 7 years ago, all of a sudden it had been implemented where we are now as a big bang, that might have resulted in something different. But it feels like it's very been and this, and then and it's kind of been slowly coming. I think the people who hold those roles have been part of the journey, so there's the acceptance there, rather than you don't have generally people moving into those roles who have no FS background at all. So this is all completely new to them. I think they've come along the journey.
I'd certainly say that my impression of lots of senior people in financial services are very robust characters. Let's face it. So yeah, I think if I don't think I don't think the concept of individual accountability is so alien to those people that it was never going to work. I do find it quite interesting, and I think this is something that, looking to the future, I think is on the FCA's agenda. I do think they would be keen for some scalps, as in I think they would want to be able to show this particular conduct by this particular individual has led to this, and the point is that what we see at the moment is that comes out in things like insider trading, so effectively true criminal activity.
Back to the older transactional activity rather than
anything culturally or etc. So, and I think at the moment, I wouldn't say that frustrates regulators, but I think they appreciate another perspective on the senior management regime, which may go to answer your question, is it's not as though huge numbers of people have lost their jobs or lost their careers as a result of the introduction of the senior managers regime. And so now I would say that's because institutions like Charlie's and others have responded in the right way. Whether the regulator or consumer groups would necessarily agree with that perspective is another matter. I mean, there are certainly consumer groups out there that think the FCA could already have done a lot more in terms of being aggressive towards individuals.
But I suppose that's answered by a kind of single overall kind of observation or thought, which is, has the culture, in your view, in larger and small financial institutions significantly shifted in a positive way over the last 5 years? Do you think it has, James?
I mean, I do. And the reason for that is, I think, the conversations at all levels in the in different financial institutions, from big to small, difference in products, different customer bases, are much more focused on customer outcomes. Certainly, I mean, perhaps whether the 5 years is the right time horizon to think about that is a separate question. But certainly, a long time ago when I started my career, some conversations would be much more almost focused entirely on the bottom line, and the bottom line was one of the things that was being weighed. Certainly among all of our clients, our team would definitely say that we have a far greater focus on actually what does this mean for the customer. And one of the things that's gone alongside that, and I think organisations like yours, others, have helped to do this, is it's, say, 15 years ago, it all felt a bit light and fuzzy to basically say, if we're really nice to customers, then we'll end up as the winners. I think that's now increasingly, like, being customer centric is increasingly seen as the way to succeed commercially. Whereas, as I say, I think a very long time ago, that would have been seen as a slightly fluffy view. Whereas I think now, particularly in the fintech space, the number of fintechs in particular that are overtly saying we're going to use our technology to just deliver something that's much better to our customer base, and that is our mission, is I think very, very telling. And those organizations tend to attract the kind of people who are much less interested in having a sort of a, oh well, that might mean 2.5% off the bottom line type conversation.
Right, so replacing competition on the actual bottom line number, quite a small difference in that number, but material in the old days. Replacing that to service, culture, and things like this, you're seeing as the big change, really.
Yeah, and I think that also expresses itself in things like balanced scorecards. I think they are genuinely more balanced, like different factors. I don't know whether you want to talk to that, but I think different factors are given heavy weight.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. And I think I come back to the point I made earlier around it. I guess it depends on what the culture of that organisation was beforehand. So because I don't know if you'll know at Metro, it's been very much since the beginning around customer service, focusing on customers. And whether or not an organisation has had that kind of inner ethos built into their culture from the beginning, or is on a journey towards that, I think you're right, and that's the direction of travel. How much changes, I think, depends on where the organisation was beforehand, and actually how much that's going to change with sort of the consumer coming in. What that will mean depends. It might not mean much change for some organisations because they're already there and they're already doing it. It's just now part of the regulation, whereas it might be a bigger change for others.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a consumer angle on this, but there's also the so back in 2008, there's a lot of talk about finding and rooting out bad apples. All this kind of conversation was really current. But do you think that's what's happened, that the bad apples have been sorted out, or do you think we've actually managed to reform the culture so that the bad apples have kind of become less bad, as it were? James?
That's a really good question. I may save that for my next book. I think it's probably a combination of both, because I think, one of the things that I spent a lot of my career in house at one of the major high street banks, and I think it is fair to say that it's undoubtedly the case that conduct that would have been acceptable 12 years ago would not be acceptable now, in a whole range of contexts. Actually thinking about it, I think what I can't say with confidence is that the result of the bad apples, to your phrase, not being there at all, or is that the culture is such that people know they just can't act like that? I'm not. I wouldn't pretend to know exactly where that boundary is, but I think there is no doubt that there is a change. I think.
Yeah, we had a question from
Yes.
online. So Mark Deegan has asked, it seems that the transition out of COVID is more challenging from recent experiences. Does the panel have a view on this at the moment?
Go first, Charlie.
In a broad sense, I guess, yes. I get in terms of if the question, the move towards hybrid working, you've got the technological side of that, having hybrid panel discussions versus the leading in a hybrid world, I think is something that it's being more and more recognized that it is challenging. It's not going to be leading in the same way as it would have been kind of pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. So I agree. I think that is a challenge in terms of how organizations work. I think it's something that will take a while for organizations to really understand how that's going to work and how they can best support customers and their colleagues and employees through this. And we're still transitioning. I don't think we've transitioned and we're there and we're all done. I think there's still that feeling towards how we're moving and how the world is going to look like in a year, in a couple of years, in 5 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that takes us forward to the next part of our conversation, which is about the future, where we're going now. And indeed, I suppose that's one of the key features, is that move back into a post-COVID world, whatever that means. But do you think we're going to be definitely see that trend, that first trend we talked about less tick box, more responsibility amongst managers and the cultural responsibility. Is that something which the FCA and the other regulatory bodies are still pushing for, or is that dead?
No, I mean, it's very, very clear that the consumer duty, which I keep talking about because I think it is still slightly underplayed. I think that's actually a massive piece of work for most organisations to grapple with. But the consumer duty is in my view, a sort of a tacit acceptance that having thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of very, very detailed rules saying please do all of these things has not in its own right delivered the outcomes that the regulator wants. And so this is an attempt effectively to say, notwithstanding that we've got all those rules, we're now going to have an extra rule saying that firms must, or principle, the new principle 12 saying that firms must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. I think one of the interesting things about the way the FCA rules are actually created, and this is one of the things, having in 2013, I was actually there, so I've actually seen behind the scenes of the sausage factory, is actually, if you were to print out the whole FCA handbook, it would scare the hell out. It scares the hell out of most regulatory lawyers in terms of the sheer volume of rules. And actually, even the FCA acknowledge that also that volume of complex regulation actually operates as a barrier to entry in its own right. If you were looking to start a new financial services business, just working out what rules you need to comply with is a substantial job. I mean, we do a lot of that for people as economically as we can manage. But I think what that means is that all those rules still mean that bad outcomes take place. And I think effectively the diagnosis the FCA have realised is the only solution to that is to have a culture in which everyone in the organisation is genuinely committed to customer outcomes, and that actually simply handing people lists of rules, if your culture's not right, some things will still go wrong, whether deliberately or otherwise.
And is that the approach we're taking in Metro, really putting?
Yeah, just embedding, what's the right thing for the customer is just embedded throughout what we do, processes, training, how we work. I think since day one for us, that's been how we have said this is the way we'll operate. So again, coming back to the point, I think whether that's a big shift or whether we look at that and go, yeah, actually we're kind of okay here. Maybe there's a few tweaks. Whereas I think for some organisations, the mindset shift might be bigger.
I'll just pick up on one very specific thing. Both the papers on the consumer duty talk a lot about putting yourself in the customer's shoes. I mean, I first started working for a major bank in 2009 actually, and to be honest, the businesses that I supported then, that is how they went about product design. Like, so I personally have never had a deep insight into an experience where people at least didn't say that's what they did. So I would agree. I think for some organisations, and I think this is part of where lots of organisations are in very different places in terms of what they think about the consumer duty, because lots of firms would read that type of statement and say, well, that is what we've always done.
I had a further question just on this point regarding consumer duty. Thank you to that person that sent it in. Please ask panelists to throw some lights on major differences between TCF and consumer duty, how it is implementable at smaller organisation level, and help to rearrange systems and controls within the firm.
Yeah.
So if we can kick off with what is TCF, what is consumer duty, and then what the differences are, that would be great.
So TCF, and I mean, it's such a good question, because the kind of conversations that we had about the introduction of treating customers fairly in around I guess 2008-ish time, feel very, very similar, that it was all about, here are these principles. If you follow the principles, the main one of which being the principle that firms should treat their customers fairly and take their interests into account. And there was lots of, even then, there were lots of discussions about like, oh, does that mean we don't need all these rules? Because if you just follow the principles, then you'll probably be in and around the right place. Well, whatever one thinks about treating customers fairly, the FCA clearly doesn't think it's succeeded, because one of the things you mentioned earlier, Tom, was about repetitive regulation. The introduction of Principle 12 very much feels like it's aiming at the same target as TCF. Slightly oddly, and I think this is maybe a political strategy on the FCA's part, TCF is actually still going to stay. So we will still have the principle that you must treat your customers fairly and take their interests into account, but we will now also have a principle to say that you have to act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. And so I think to answer the specific question about the differences, I'd say there's two. One is quite a detailed, granular point, and one is a bit broader. The detailed point is that sitting underneath the consumer duty, there are more layers of detail, more layers of quasi rules, you might want to call them, in terms of certain cross-cutting rules. And so, for example, you must act in good faith towards your customer, towards retail customers. And the FCA basically say, if you do the 3 cost-cutting rules, then you'll probably be doing the consumer duty. But then there are more layers still, because there are then 4 particular outcomes on which you need to focus. And this is where, to me, it actually ceases to feel like true principles-based regulation, because some of the 4 outcomes, one of which is deliver fair value, which basically requires all firms, this is like a practical action that I strongly urge everyone to start planning if you're not already doing. It's very, very clear that for that outcome, the FCA expects firms to have examined the way you make money across your entire product set offered to retail customers and actually decided, is that fair value and why? And so I think that, so the first difference is, while it feels hugely nebulous, so you must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers, the FCA have at least pointed us down 4 particular roads and effectively signalled these 4 outcomes are the ones we really care about, fair value being the one that worries me the most, because I read the things that they want you to do, and I still think I'm still struggling to work out, how do you actually decide that your price is a fair price? It's like each level of what they've written just seem to sort of beg that, leave you hanging slightly. But then I think the second piece, which I think again is taking the FCA at face value, what they clearly think has happened with TCF is that TCF has kind of ossified into there'll be long conversations, and then at the end of the conversation there's another box to tick in which someone says, have we considered TCF? And everyone goes, yes, we have, and then you tick the box. I'm not saying that's the way organisations operate, but that does seem to be the thing that the FCA thinks TCF has, as I say, ossified into. And this is, I mean, cynically, this is another attempt to maybe make that concept of start from what's a good outcome for the customer and work backwards. This is another way of trying to score that.
And that's not my particular area of expertise, but I think this is definitely one of the areas where we would rely on the experts to be trying to sift through and distill that into what practically would that mean.
And also work out how much overlap there is between one and the last, because it seems to me you're describing something which is kind of massive overlap across the 2, and also more prescriptive rules as well than we've seen for a while. So,
and there's about 70 pages of guidance on what the handbook text means.
Okay, guidance on the text means, brilliant. So are they looking for scalps, do you think? Do you think that there's a real push to the FCA to find some scopes this time around?
I think there's probably two slightly different ways of looking at that. As I said a few minutes ago, I think there is a feeling that there needs to be something more tangible out of the individual accountability reforms that actually that there needs to be something more than, say, an insider trading or a market abuse style prosecution. As I don't have any particular insight as to who they might be, who if anyone they might be looking at, but I think that is definitely on their mind. The second piece on the consumer duty specifically, which we keep coming back to because I think that is the biggest regulatory change on people's plates, certainly in the next couple of years. What they have said is they acknowledge that this is going to be an iterative process. So they're certainly not going to be breaking people's doors down in April 2023 to say you're in breach of the new Principle 12. I think where firms in particular will be exposed is come sort of Q2, Q3 2023, if you get asked by your supervisors, what, if any, changes have you made as a result of the introduction of Principle 12? If your answer is nothing at all, then be ready to defend that position because you're basically saying we were already perfect.
Yes, yeah. And overall, this trend from regulatory rules, specific and clear rules, to culture and responsibility seems to me to be the trend of the last longer than 5 years, and looks like it's going to continue beyond that. There's so Charlie, is that the way you see it in summary?
Yes, I think so. I do think sometimes as we've talked in detail about the volume of regulation still there, probably in some ways it's a bit overwhelming when you're looking at that. So there's this overwhelming need to comply with the regulations and build the culture around that. And I think it's important to take a step back and say, yeah, we're really focused on making sure that we understand the regulations and we're doing everything we need to do, but take that step back and go, but making sure it's part of our culture as well. I think that is the way we're moving, but it's challenging when you've got these sort of two distinct ways of looking at things and operating, and making sure you find a way that combines both of them.
Yeah.
And ironically, I think historically the FCA has blamed lawyers for this. And one very specific example of that is when the FCA amended their guidance on unfair terms, which applies to all consumer contracts, but the FCA is the enforcer of that for financial services firms. One of the things that guidance basically said is, in our interactions with firms, firms tend to go straight to technical legal arguments as to why what they've done complies with the statute, whereas what we ask is it fair? And that, again, I think that probably has actually delivered what they sought to deliver, because certainly I know clients that have had unfair terms challenges in the past, where now the culture of that organisation would be much more about, like, is this the right thing to do, as opposed to, can our lawyers persuade the regulator or a court that legally speaking they were permitted to?
Yes.
Whereas the FCA would definitely say that people like me do the second.
Right. Yes. So there's a tension between the quantity of regulation and the professional support needed to interpret it, and then that other push, which is that interpretation in itself is breaks it down into a way in which its spirit is potentially somewhat lost. But with that, I'd like to thank you both. That was a really interesting debate about the last 5 years. It's really great to get an opportunity to actually focus on the heart of the regulatory changes to financial services. And I'd like to thank you, Charlie, and you, James, for joining me this morning for what was a really great debate. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Tom, for hosting that great conversation. I think, as always, we could go on for hours talking down rabbit holes. My 3 key takeaways today were examine the way we make money and understand whether it's value. I think that's a really good point, and definitely speak to James and Olivia at Osborne Clark if you need some help around that. Also, as Charlie mentioned at the end, my second point was the volume of regulation is very much still there. So we can't drop the ball, and it's really important that we stay on it for the foreseeable future. And thirdly, don't panic. The FCA play with the lawyers anyway, so it doesn't matter. So thanks, James. No, but jokes aside, you know, conversations like this, networking, and this group really highlight the value of coming together and sharing best practice. So thank you everyone for joining us today. The next one will be in June, where we're hoping to host just an in-person event. So all of you guys at home, hopefully you'll have to drag yourselves to London, but that will be in June, and we'll probably dive into a couple of these topics. But I'd love to hear from anyone who has a specific thing they want to talk about at the next session. But otherwise, have a lovely morning, and thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.